and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm coming to you today from this year's Khazanah Megatrends Forum, where my guest today has just delivered a keynote address titled A Theory of Everyone, a new science of who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. So I'm delighted to welcome to the show Professor Michael Muthukrishna. He's an Associate Professor of Economic Psychology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His work on cultural evolution, how our cultures shape everything from innovation to corruption to decision-making, all of that has earned him widespread recognition. So today on the program, we're going to be discussing with him a little further how understanding cultural evolution can help us navigate diversity, tackle global challenges, and hopefully even get a prediction of where humanity is headed. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Muthukrishna. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me, Melissa.
All right, so I'm going to start with maybe just to get a perspective or to kind of situate us with your work. So maybe you can begin by sharing what it is that is the central question that your work is striving to answer. What is driving your research?
Yeah, so actually, there are three main questions that I work on, and I'm going to do it backwards. So the first question is, why are humans so different to other animals? So, clearly we are other animals. We reproduce, we eat, we have to do, we have to do the things that other animals do. But we're clearly also different. You and I are on a TV show. Our closest relative chimpanzees are sitting naked in the rain. So there's a difference. But my interest isn't so much in just answering how it is that humans diverged from our last common ancestor. My interest is in that if we want to build a better model for ourselves and where we're headed into the future, that question can help inform that. Because if we understand how it is that we got here, then we can begin to understand where it is that we're going or where it is that we could go.
Okay.
And part of that question is that I see, so I was an engineer actually in my training, and I was working in that field, and I kind of had this moment where I was like, I have two choices here. One is I could make a bunch of money and then die. But that seems kind of boring, actually. We're all going to die. I also see some problems ahead, and I feel like people aren't really paying enough attention. So I watched Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. And after watching this, I started reading the IPCC reports. I started reading the Pentagon reports because I thought, look, if anybody's thinking about this, it's military. And it seemed to me that Gore was right. But his idea that we were going to slow the economy to save the planet seemed unrealistic. And that meant thinking about what it would be like to live in a climate-changed world. What it would be like, and that means, another inconvenient truth is that there are going to be winners and losers when it comes to climate change. That means mass migration. It means, you can see it here in Malaysia, changing seasons, right? Early monsoons, dry seasons, flooding, and so on. What happens when 1 million Bangladeshis are underwater? What happens when the South Pacific, where are those people going to go? And if they get absorbed into places like India, the Middle East, or Australia, are the institutions ready for that? And I got my answer. So I started working in this area. I decided to kind of switch tiers in 2010. And I got my answer in 2015 with the Syrian migration crisis. So what a lot of people don't realize is that there was the Arab Spring protests going on, but in Syria what was interesting was that the crops failed due to climate change. And as a result of this, people moved from the rural centers to the urban centers. And they moved there and the infrastructure couldn't cope, right? There weren't enough jobs, housing, and so on. And so what would people do? Well, they start to protest. Now, the specifics of how the regime reacted to that have to do with geopolitics. So there's all these pieces that have to be put together to understand where we're going. And then eventually you had a migration crisis in Europe, and I would argue that really shifted the geopolitical landscape in Europe when it comes to Germany's position, when it comes to the European project, when it comes to Brexit. One of the major drivers of that was concerns around immigration, right? So these massive knock-on effects in this very complex system. And what my work is trying to do is to identify the underlying rules so that we can figure out where the levers are that we can pull to keep us on the track.
Okay, I love that. So let's figure out so you have essentially put forth some of the core ideas of what you think are the underlying rules. So talk to me about the core ideas in your book, A Theory of Everyone. Particularly, I thought was very interesting when you wrote, and if I may quote you, we cannot move without energy, we cannot reproduce, cannot do anything at all.
Yeah.
At the heart of the theory of everyone is the quest for the capture and control of energy. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So, you know, in the book, another story that I have is the story of these two fish, right? They're swimming along, and you know, they meet another fish, and the older fish says to them, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two fish keep swimming, and then one turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And what this is meant to illustrate is there are some things that are just so ubiquitous we stop thinking about them. And energy is one of those things, right? Our whole society runs runs in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution. It completely shifted everything. Here we are with cameras running on electricity, lighting all around us. Anything that a human can do, they can do it empowered with energy, and it allows us to cooperate with one another. Now, I came to this, you know, I should tell listeners actually the story of how I came to this, because I think it reveals what's going on here. So I was working on the problem of cooperation. This is a super important scientific question. In 2005, Science magazine, one of the major two journals, Nature and Science, listed it as one of the top 25 questions for the coming quarter century. And what happened was that since then, and before as well, people had identified various mechanisms that would support cooperation. What is cooperation? It's the tendency to do something that is in the benefit of the group at your personal expense. So they identified, for example, what's called inclusive fitness or kin selection. And that is to say that genes that can identify and favor copies of themselves will spread at the expense that genes ignore that. So across the animal kingdom, we find that parents favor their children. We favor our relatives. Everywhere across the animal kingdom you see this. A lion will come in, kill the lioness's old cubs, replace the lion that was there, but won't kill its own cubs. Why? Because it's related, right? They'd identified reciprocal altruism. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They'd identified reputation, right? So Melissa, you and I have just met, but I've heard about you. I've heard from other people that you're a great interviewer, so therefore I'm more likely to come on the show. So reputation can do some of it. The highest scales of cooperation that humans have achieved have been thanks to our institutions. So it's not that, you know, if somebody steals something from me, I go on a vigilante quest, or even necessarily try to find their reputation. I pay my taxes to your government, police force, judiciary, and so on. So that was the state of affairs. And then, you know, around 2014, as I was thinking about this problem, I realized that, wait a minute, all these mechanisms are always present. Identifying them isn't an answer, because around the world, many governments don't work. And the reason that they don't work is what we call corruption. And as I was looking at it through the lens of cooperation, I realized that what corruption really is one lower scale of cooperation, the more natural scales. The tendency to favor our friends through direct reciprocity or indirect reciprocity, the tendency to favor our family because we share genes, undermining institutions, meritocracy, and so on. So if it is the case that these lower scales are always present, how did we rise up? Then I started to look at the graphs, and I realized, okay, what's going on is that there had to be something that tipped us into a positive sum world where it was beneficial for us to work together rather than go down to these lower levels. And it became very clear that energy was the ceiling that did this. And then I'm telling you too much, but it applies across the animal kingdom.
So I'm fascinated by this. But let's talk about the relationship between cooperation and corruption. And that's quite fascinating. So when we think about that, that when we favor our friends, cronism, when we favor our family, nepotism, that is a rung lower than cooperation. How do we think about that when we know culturally corruption is frowned upon, but so embedded in some societies?
So the corruption is another form of cooperation, as you rightly said. And actually, corruption is not a puzzle to be explained at all. And the reason is that, as I said, it's the most natural thing in the world. To favor your family and to be there for your friends isn't just something that's a human universal. It's something that's been with us through history and is found across the animal kingdom. The puzzle is, how did some societies manage to suppress that tendency? That's the real puzzle. So if you look across history, there are contingent moments that led, for example, Europe to destroy its tribes. So the Catholic Church actually ends up banning one thing. It bans cousin marriage, and it changes European family structure. So if people tend to marry their cousins, as they do in many parts of the world and in Europe too through history, then your uncle isn't just your uncle, he's related to you, but you don't have family trees, you have family webs, right? And so what this leads to is a kind of tribalism where you can cooperate thanks to these kin relations, but under those conditions, a state can't function. So Europe destroys its tribes through these rules enforced by the church and lays the foundations for individualism, which also has its effects, right? For example, a loneliness epidemic, the tendency to not look after elders and so on. You know, so Europe destroys its tribes, leads to individualism, but also lays the foundations for successful democracy. Then it tries to export that into other parts of the world. And this is where the trouble starts. Because you're interacting with other places that don't necessarily have that. So they still have to achieve that. So if you look at all the anti-corruption mechanisms that tend to work, they are ones that disrupt cooperative mechanisms, cooling off periods, right? So you can't just go from lobbying to government and back again and exploit the relationships you've developed. Or having a third party. You know, all of these work the same way.
Put that into a real life example for us. So
Yeah.
Malaysia's been on, the current government has talked a lot about its anti-corruption stance. But if you were to give them advice of how to apply your research into real-world policy interventions, what would that look like for Malaysia, say?
So I don't, you know, I hesitate to answer specifically for Malaysia because I don't know enough about the Malaysian context. In fact, I would have to look up, in fact, where it lies in the Corruption Perceptions Index. But I'll give you examples of things that work in other places. So in Botswana, for example, one of the things that they do is they don't allow government officials to work on their own home area. They can't work for their own group. Now that might seem counterintuitive, but that's where their links are. What you're trying to do is prevent the links that would otherwise undermine them. So they don't get to work on their own area, they have to work for the benefit of a different area.
That does sound counterintuitive.
Another example is, you know, is that they rotate people regularly. So, I mean, it's not great for quality of life, but again, it prevents those individuals from forming these connections that then begin to undermine these more efficient systems. So the general rule is that you're looking for the kinds of cooperative relationships that are present throughout society, and that can provide private information that isn't necessarily distortive, but also when you're doing things on the basis of obligations and relationships, although it's very natural, although it's ever present, and it's very human to do that, it's the kind of worse equilibrium compared to a more meritocratic system where regardless of where you're born, there isn't a ceiling based on the happenstance of your birth, but instead people can build relationships that are not undermining the system.
Right. So that also, a large part of your work talks about diversity in society and how diversity can really be an impetus or a catalyst for innovation. So talk to me, and this kind of boils back down to your research looking at migration and how societies are composed. So how do we think about diversity in fostering innovation?
So I think one of the most important insights from this body of research is that innovation isn't actually an individual activity. Like we have the sense that these innovators are sitting down, like Isaac Newton, he's sitting down and he's in isolation, figuring things out.
And he's been able to do that because he's born smart.
He's brilliant, you know, he's smarter than everyone else around, and he's coming, you know, Einstein, he's sitting there, he's doing these things. If you look, one of the odd things about science and innovation is that every scientist is convinced they're a genius. Every innovator thinks they see further than all the other idiots around them, right? But they're also afraid of being scooped. Now that seems strange. Why, if you see so much further than others, are you afraid that others will catch up and beat you? And the reason is because we're all in the same idea ecosystem. We're all operating. And Isaac Newton came up with the idea of calculus, and so did Leibniz. And he was upset because he thought that Leibniz had stolen the ideas from him. Leibniz hadn't stolen the ideas. They'd been reading the same papers. They'd been listening to the same great TV shows, obviously not, but you know, today that's what people do. When they're exposed to the same ideas, they recombine in people's heads. Now, what does that mean about diversity? It means that people who can see the world differently and who bring different life experience offer new fuel, new recombinatorial potential for this collective brain, for this kind of crowd computing that drives innovation. But that only works if the ideas can actually meet. So one of the things that I describe in the collective brain is what I call the paradox of diversity. The diversity is fuel for innovation, but also divisive. Here's an example. If we were to conduct this interview and we didn't speak the same language, how many ideas were really going to flow between us? So that's an obvious, if we don't have a common language, it's one of the biggest challenges to building a common society, right? But then there's other norms. So some norms don't matter at all. So perhaps, you like sushi and I like schnitzels. Honestly, we'll figure it out. We'll find a market that sells what we both like. But if it is about social relationships, the value of education, the importance of honesty, power distances, if we're not aligned on these or aligned on goals, these can create frictions that prevent the ideas from flowing in our collective brain. And more importantly, if we don't trust one another, then the synapses of our collective brain can't fire.
How do we navigate that? Because the more diverse a society is, I'm sure the more diverse the thinking, the values, the rules that govern our behavior. How do we navigate that?
So there's a whole host of techniques that one could use. At a kind of national level, I described the various models that exist in the world. So there is the mosaic model that's associated with Canada, where you have different societies and you say, listen, different ethnic groups, you just live your own lives, it's fine. It's like a beautiful mosaic. But the thing about mosaics is that they are more fragile compared to a single pane of glass when put under pressure. And so, if Canada faces slowed economic growth, I suspect they're in trouble. Another alternative is the American melting pot, right? Everybody goes into the pot, you mix it up, and it's a new American identity. That can work, although the melting pot idea is breaking down in America. It can work, except that some flavors might dominate more than others, let's say, Another model is a model associated with the French, which is the no-hyphen model. There's no Algerian French, no Muslim French, it's just French. But of course, that really means you have to be able to cross party lines or cross ethnic lines and say, you really are French, we welcome you, but that doesn't happen in practice. So the model I advocate is what I call the umbrella model. So it's a recognition that resources are at the heart of this. And we're all under the same umbrella, and if we fight over it, we all get wet in the rain, right? And so an example of this is when refugees come into places, for example, in Africa, when they come in with resources, that is, there's investment in housing and infrastructure, then people welcome them. But if newcomers put pressure on existing resources, that's when the locals are naturally, when schools are hard to get into and hospitals are, the lines are very long, and now there's newcomers coming to this that make the whole thing more difficult, they're naturally resentful. But I'll give you one last example that I think will go home. Explicitness of communication. In societies that have had long-run histories of migration, an example is America, they tend to be much more explicit in communication. Now, a contrast to that is Japan. In Japan, there isn't necessarily like explicit demonstration of emotion. You know what a Japanese person knows what another Japanese person feels from the context. Now, Americans are known for smiling, right? They're known for explicit smiling because if your neighbor's from a completely different place and doesn't even speak your language, one thing we have in common is emotion. So you want to know, you want them to know when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're angry. It becomes very, very explicit. We find this in all kinds of places. To the point where, when McDonald's, I tell this story in the book, when McDonald's opened in Russia, they had to have smile training for the workers.
No.
And the workers said, we can't do this because in Russia, if someone smiles and there's no joke, they're a crazy person. So they said, okay, well, we're going to train you and we're going to train the customers that here is an American experience, so you have to do it. So eventually Russians learned that if someone's smiling and there's no joke, they're either a crazy person or they're American.
I love that you've taken such an interdisciplinary approach to your work. I mean, you said you're an engineer, but you use data science, but you have a very you use anthropology to kind of make, if I'm saying that correctly, psychology and economics to inform your work. Why is that important? Very few people actually look at it from such an interdisciplinary lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because I'm motivated by the problems that we face. And I never really wanted to be a professor. That wasn't the goal. It was just to solve the problems. And so I have a problem in front of me, and I actually don't like the term interdisciplinary because it still emphasizes the disciplines.
Okay. Right.
I prefer non-disciplinary, or I call it, if I'm joking, I'll say I'm an undisciplined scholar.
We like the labels, and we like our boxes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm an undisciplined scholar in that I have problems, and I actually don't care where the solutions come from. They can come from economics, political science, data science, mathematics. I just need to solve them.
Right.
And the issue that we face is, we're in a world that is, the World Economic Forum refers to as a polycrisis, right? we're seeing a bunch of things happen at the same time. Not only is there climate change, but we also have polarization. We have geopolitical conflicts. After such a long time of peace, it seems like the world is teetering again. America and Britain, where I live right now, were once beacons of stability and freedom and democracy. Now, you don't know what direction they're going to go, and everyone's nervous about where everything goes from here. Different disciplines are looking at this, and it's like the classic story of the elephant and the blind men. So these blind men, they walk up to an elephant, and one feels its side and says, "I think it's a wall." Another grabs its tail and says, "No, no, it's a rope." Another grabs the tusks and says, "No, I think it's a spear." The other grabs, and so on. Different disciplines have different answers to this, but only when you put the pieces together and you have this overarching theory of everyone that you can see the elephant in the room. And the elephant is like our society. If you want to guide the elephant somewhere, and you push the wrong thing or you press the wrong thing, you're in real trouble. So you really have to take the full perspective.
So if we were to take your work, a theory of everyone, and apply that to tackling some of our biggest problems. You talked about living in a climate-changed world.
Yeah.
How do we think about that? And I'm going to come back to the issue of energy, understanding our relationship with energy to understand our relationship with the future.
Yeah.
Could you explain to us why it is so important that we understand this quest and control for energy?
Yeah, so this is a pattern, that you find from the earliest single-celled life that decided instead of, taking photosynthesis energy from the sun and moving at plant pace, it would eat other life and rely on the energy that they'd saved up through ATP and little sugars. It's the story of colonialization where Britain had pre-existing, so there are 4 laws in my book: cooperation, innovation, energy, and evolution. Britain had pre-existing guilds, for example, that they moved away from family-based corporations, in part because of the Catholic Church's move, and this meant that talent could be allocated more freely. They also had technology to exploit the energy so that when they discovered cheap and available coal, they could build the largest empire the world had ever seen. And then they went out, and like those single-celled or those multi-celled organisms eating others, they started to eat other societies, right? They started to absorb them in until those societies learned from them. If you look at any metric of progress, child survival rates, GDP per capita, quality of life, longevity, anything, it doesn't really matter. You see a pattern where it's all flat until we hit the Industrial Revolution, at which point we discovered stored sunlight. We discovered coal, which is peat, turned to black rock, pressure cooked by millions of years into portable batteries, right? Zooplankton and algae turned to oil and natural gas. And we relied on this to superpower our societies. Think of how far you can get on a bicycle versus an airplane. Think of how quickly you can build a bookshelf with with a manual screwdriver versus an electric screwdriver. But here's the problem. We haven't had to think about energy for so long because it has been so plentiful and abundant. Millions of years of charging these batteries, we've depleted them in a couple of centuries. One metric I highlight in the book, there's many other factors that matter, availability, power, and so on, but one metric is what's called energy return on investment. It's how much energy it takes to get some amount of energy back. If a cheetah spends more energy chasing down an animal than it gets from what it eats, it will die. If you look at how much energy it takes to get some amount of energy back, if you look at, say, oil discovery rates, in 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000 barrels. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100 barrels, and by 2010, 1 barrel of oil found you another 5. Now, there's still plenty of energy. So the U.S., for example, is now a net energy exporter once more, and for that reason, I think I'm quite bullish about it. But if we don't make that transition, we almost began that transition with the nuclear age, which then was stilted. And now, with restarting nuclear reactors around the world, I think we can push up. Okay. The next stage, so there's 2 paths ahead of us, right? So one is, or there's 3, I would say. One is nuclear power, which has amazing energy return on investment metrics. But the Koreans are making it cheaply. Not everyone is. It's not easy necessarily to make. A lot of the problems people think of nuclear, they're like thinking about problems in 1950s cars and applying them today. They just don't apply anymore. We know how to deal with this. The second is fusion. So if we crack fusion and we use the most abundant material, element in the universe, hydrogen, to power our societies, we're golden. And the third is there's a fusion reactor in the sky. We call it the sun. And we can exploit that through solar power, which has become cheaper and is reasonable. We have a problem that we haven't solved in terms of storing that power, but I would say like solar, nuclear, and perhaps fusion if we ever get there, as being the next stage. And once we do that, everything else will follow.
Okay.
We'll innovate.
So where you argue that we've been taking energy for
granted,
granted because of all the abundance. But now, how do we stop ourselves from taking it for granted?
I mean, the first thing I think is to see the problem. Before you can solve the problem, you need to see the problem. And you can see there's a great website called WTF Happened in 1971. And all it is graph after graph of shifts that happened in the early 1970s, 71 to 73 basically, where inequality goes up, quality of life stagnates, productivity stagnates, everything just shifts in 1970s. And some people blame, the website would like to blame it on Nixon shock, the moving away from the Bretton Woods system and so on. I'd say that something else happened there that was much more pivotal, and it was the OPEC oil crisis. So it created an artificial restriction in energy, and you can actually see U.S. energy and world energy usage just plateau. And alongside that, because there's an almost perfect relationship between GDP per capita and energy use per capita. So the whole thing just collapsed, and we're living in that kind of era.
Okay, this is interesting. So, so for the broader public, if I may, in the minute or so that we have left, can I ask you, what are you hoping that the readers of your book, and people who follow your research, what is it that you're hoping they take away from it, or sparks the next conversation, the next research? What is it that you're hoping for?
There is nothing that humans have ever been able to do alone. We might point to the great leaders of the past, but it was never just one person. Our greatest achievements and our worst atrocities are always collective acts. And my hope is that if more people understand what's going on and they understand their place in the human story, then they can see how it is that they can right the ship where exactly they are, be they leaders, be they policymakers, be they prime ministers, CEOs, whatever position they might be in. If you can understand the system that you see in front of you, then it's no longer chaotic and confusing. It's something you can move away from alchemy, where you're just trying random things and hoping for the best, to chemistry, where you're using a periodic table and an understanding of elements to truly make new materials. In this case, remake our societies to better match opportunity and talent so that we don't leave money on the table with the future, to create a world where education keeps up with a changing society, because right now it is stagnated. It was the factory model created for creating factory workers. And create a society that helps us realize human potential, which at the moment has stagnated alongside energy.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing your work and your insights with us. Fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.